Hi, welcome to another episode of I Must Stash You Something. I've got, I'm going to say it, nice and neat for Anna Mina here. You knew I was going to do that, right?
I knew that you were gonna do that. Yes.
So I will um, show everybody my phone here that this is the contact that is in my phone, that it says nice and neat for Anna. Can I tell them the story behind this?
Of course.
So I've alluded several times in this series to how old I am, and how devastating that is, and how I'm like not ready to be an uncle, but it is. I mean, there's no way I have any ground to stand on if I have Anna here, who is an adult with thoughts and hopes and dreams and contributions to society. And she in some respects, you are more of an adult than I am. Um, and I have the dubious distinction of not necessarily like nobody would ask me to babysit, but my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, which is a word we're not allowed to say, but we weren't engaged, and your mom asked Mary to babysit you, and you were actually a baby, like you were like a year and a half old, and like it wasn't like how people need to babysit me now. They like you were an actual baby needed to be babysat, and Mary didn't actually tell your mom. I don't know if you know this part of the story, but your Mary didn't tell your mom that I was coming. Like I just kind of showed up, and your mom was like,
Yeah, I know that when she's not expecting something. Oh, hello.
but to her credit, like I think a lot of people would have been like, no, you can't bring your boyfriend. Like get out of here. But it was either her trust for Mary or her desperation to have childcare. Like one of those made it so that she was like, okay, sure, yeah, you and your boyfriend can hang out in my house unsupervised. Like, this is a great idea. Uh, so we were 20, I don't know, probably like 23, 22, something like that. And the entire time we were watching you, we'd be like, okay, Anna, do you want to play with the blocks? Oh, do you want to color? Do you want to blah, blah? And she goes, yeah, nice and neat for Anna. For Anna. And we were like, okay, we've got a compulsive disorder waiting to
Yeah.
happen.
Yep.
And hopefully it's just, on the manageable end of the spectrum, not something that becomes, problematic.
I feel
So,
like lately it's been coming out more.
I don't need to tell you this. Like, what happens if you use the wrong PowerPoint format for the college meeting?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, no, I'm the same way. I mean, I think there's a difference between like being a perfectionist though and being like having OCD with like cleanliness things. I feel like when I like for a while I went in the complete opposite direction because Tita and my mom are like very like everything has to be perfect, measure it with a ruler type like folding. And I did not care about that. And then I feel like with as I got older, but also definitely in quarantine, the more time I've had to organize things and reorganize them, even though they didn't need to be, I still do it.
Yep, yep. And like regardless of how obsessive you may be with stuff around the house or what have you, I don't think it's normal behavior for me to threaten people's lives if I don't like the way that they did the watermark on the picture, and that's not the format that we follow. Like it's just the 10 of us. It's like the 10 people that show up to the meeting. Like, who cares? So I do, and I want it to look professional. And like, yes, if it's the 10 of us and we're just talking amongst ourselves, there's no reason why we need to do this, you know, vagabondry with the, improper edges on the photo. Like it needs to look like, why not make it look nice? But no, I probably shouldn't be threatening people's lives over it. So Mark Khalil, if you're listening, I apologize. Rafi Hanna, if you're listening, I do not apologize. So Mark probably doesn't deserve how often I threaten his life. Rafi deserves it.
I can agree on that.
Rafi deserves it. I should probably be kinder to Mark, and I probably am too kind as it is to Rafi, even though I threaten his life regularly. So anyway, now we've moved on from, well, we haven't moved on from nice and neat for Anna. We're just a adult version of nice and neat for Anna.
Yeah, I literally put that on my little lettering board in my like apartment at school, because I nothing seemed more fitting.
You got to embrace it. Like, yes, I want things nice and neat. What's wrong with that? Why
Yeah,
can't
when people see it, they're like, what? Like, what is that? I'm like, oh, it's a really long story.
And now you're a not just member, but a leader in the college and graduate class. And you're technically Natick, and I know there's people that are from other Coptic churches in the area, but you're a Natick person, so that makes things simple. Your parents are some of my favorite people in the whole world. Your dad has been the Amin al-Khidma at Natick for, I probably shouldn't say this, but I make fun of like Natick, that there was one point where like the previous person was the Amin al-Khidma, and then there was a period of time where we had two people that were Amin al-Khidma, and then like slowly it transitioned. And I know this isn't like for public consumption, and I probably shouldn't be saying this, but I always like point out to him, I'm like, so how long have you been Amin al-Khidma? And your dad's very diplomatic. He's like,
Yeah.
well, like he'll never answer.
You're never gonna get a straight answer.
Never ever. Well, the fathers and the mothers and the uncles and the fathers, and like I'm like, give me a date. You can't. I'm like, you can't give me a date because there is no date. There is this like transition period, and looks like I think it's Ted now. I think.
Like I guess.
Sure. And your mom teaches high school, and she's done so for a long time. And we have a very
me for a year, which was a lot of fun.
What's that?
She served me for a year in high school, which was so much fun. I was more excited than she was. She was embarrassed. I was excited.
Well, that's usually the opposite.
Yeah, that's how our relationship is. I'm so excited to spend more time with her, and she's embarrassed because she knows that I have a lot of dirt on her and I like to poke fun at her.
We have the same relationship. I'm maybe like, I'd love to think, I like to pretend that you and I are the same age, but like realistically, like, I'm more unfortunately in her, no, not unfortunately, like, yes, unfortunately, in her demographic. But yes, she and I have the same relationship where like.
She also has a lot of dirt on me though. So, I mean, I don't know. I don't think she should mind too much.
I mean, the goal, if you'd like to not worry about who has dirt on you, is to make yourself impervious to scandal. Like where.
Oh no, I love it. My favorite thing is when she makes fun of me, because every one of her jokes about me has a little bit of a stinging truth to it, and she just, when she imitates me, she does it so well. So.
Yeah. And like if somebody hears it, you're like, yeah, and.
Yeah, because she always is like very like wary about because she tells like embarrassing stories about me all the time, which I'm happy to do myself. And she's like, oh, was that okay? Like after the fact, I'm like, yeah, it's fine. Like, go ahead. I love it.
You're like, you should see what Mina does.
Yeah.
Yeah. So she and I have a very special relationship where she's like, where did we find you? Like, you can't say 90% of these things that you say. And I'm like, why not? And she's like, I guess I don't have a good reason. Actually, Rafi's mom,
Yeah.
Sally, I have a very similar
My
relationship
like
with Sally.
second or third mom. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, like the two of them, I'm like, come on, like, why are we like almost the same age and you're a tunt and I'm just like one of the kids? Like, why? Why? Like, why? Don't be such a tunt. Like, relax. They're like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um,
So cool. Um, I want to hear, I guess again for me, but for everybody to hear about your capstone project, because I think that is going to lead down a lot of things that are interesting. So let's just get right into it. What
okay.
what what's that about?
So, um, God really works in amazing ways because I told you this, but I was supposed to go to London to complete or fulfill my like humanities and arts like minor equivalent that all students that attend my university have to complete. And I was going to do it in music. And then with the pandemic, that got canceled. And I was like, well, now what? Because you can pretty much do anything you want. And I ended up um, signing up for like an independent study based seminar on intercultural communication with the same advisor for London. And she was really encouraging and she was like, you'll do great in this. And most students who take these seminars are like ethnically diverse to some point. So she encourages all the students to um, pursue some sort of research topic that's like that pertains to their nationality. Um, and so I thought it was such a great opportunity to do more research on identity development in American Egyptian, like adolescents and young adults. And basically for like multicultural, um, like young people in general, and how like growing up between two or three different cultural groups and influences can really cause a lot of like disarray and confusion and like I almost want to say like hopelessness, like feeling like you don't, there's nowhere where you can fully belong or fully identify. Um, and I actually had written my like college essay on that going into underground because I was just so passionate about it and I just love like anything cultural studies in general. So I decided to continue that and take it a step further and like bring in how being a Coptic Orthodox Christian also plays into that um that relationship of like feeling like in between American culture and Egyptian culture. So for the actual independent study, I ended up interviewing about like yeah, eight, eight of my peers. Some I knew well, some I didn't know as well, between like 18 and 24 years old, and just had them um, express some of the things that they went through growing up and tell me more about like how assimilated their family is and like how fluent they are in Arabic, and ask them a bunch of questions about um, you know how they are able to communicate with others um, based on their experience growing up straddled between two cultural groups and how it affects their communication with others, um, and their own identity formation. And it was really illuminating. It was very exciting. I got to like read in published academic papers, like in my research about the same like thoughts and feelings and realizations that I had to come to on my own. And I was like, I don't know if this is valid. Like, I don't know how many other people have really gone through this in the same way that I have. And I got to, you know, hear a lot of the people that I interviewed echo back to me the same things that I had been feeling growing up, even though some of them I knew really well. And obviously we had discussed things like this before, but some of the more buried things that didn't come out necessarily then, I think came out in those discussions that I had with them. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. It was a great, great project. And I'm like just really thankful that I got to, do that for credit. I got to pursue this amazing case of like detailing and documenting just a little itty bitty glimpse on like the Middle Eastern experience in America, from people that are, wide range of fluencies in Arabic, and their families assimilated at different levels, and they go to different churches around the country. So yeah, it was a lot of fun.
What'd you learn?
I learned a lot. I would say the things that stick out to me were, one, like I really wanted to focus on language and language barriers in our community, because probably the biggest reason that I felt so displaced as a kid was because of like the fact that I just was not fluent in Arabic pretty much at all. And I think this happens to a lot of other people, obviously, but for different reasons. And my parents, after 9/11, were really, really just like scared to speak to me in Arabic. My mom was very uncomfortable with it, especially like in at the time, not as much anymore, at the time, a predominantly like white town in Massachusetts. So they made the decision to not speak to me in Arabic. So I obviously wasn't fluent. And that really hurt me, honestly, a lot. A lot of people would, like at church, or other Middle Eastern people that I met would like find out I'm Middle Eastern, it'd be great, or I'm Egyptian, and then write me off when they found out that I wasn't that fluent in Arabic. And like, oh, she's not like Egyptian enough, she's not Middle Eastern enough, she doesn't understand. Even though I'm still growing up, like as time went on, obviously that fear went away. I'm still growing up around all Arabic speakers. My parents started speaking Arabic in the house again, and they spoke it all the time. My grandmother doesn't speak very good English, and I am very close with her, so I communicate with her all the time, like answering back in English, obviously. And like on my dad's side, on my mom's side, everyone I knew. I was like, I loved Arabic music. I was surrounded by Arabic music. We watched a lot of Arabic movies and TV shows. So like, and obviously going to a Coptic church, like I'm bound to pick up some Arabic. There's no way that I couldn't have, but just that lacking like real fluency in it. And until today, like my Arabic is very poor. I'm the first one to admit that. And that really, really bothered me for a long time. There were a lot of arguments that were had because of it. Like, why were you so afraid? Like, I don't understand. It doesn't make any sense to me. And like, I really, really resented it for a very long period of time because it just seemed like so pointless, like this one reason. And there were a lot of like of my really close friends at church where like it hindered our relationship a little bit because there was this awkwardness there. And so I really wanted to see how much of that was in the experiences of the different people that I talked to in my study. And for a lot of people, they talked about this like familial pressure to keep Arabic alive, for families, especially when they come to the US, which is something that I think we're all familiar with because, my extended family would make comments all the time on my Arabic and Gabby's Arabic, my younger sister. And many of the people that I spoke to had said like when they would go to visit their relatives in Egypt, they would like not be pleased with the parents that they had lost their Arabic, and like maybe the kids grew up speaking Arabic and they lost it, or they just never became familiar with the language. or maybe they were embarrassed to speak it, like they just refused to go anywhere if their parents were going to speak Arabic, so it just kind of died out, like so many different things. And it caused a lot of tension and like pain and shame in within like families, and it's like very hurtful, like you're almost made to feel like you can't do something, so you're not you don't measure up to the qualifications for you to be like Egyptian enough in this case, which doesn't feel great also because like especially for me, like I feel very Egyptian everywhere I go, like maybe not like Egyptian, maybe my family doesn't take on all the same values that someone living in Egypt might, but still like I'm eating Egyptian food 3 meals a day every day. I'm taking it to school for lunch and being made fun of for it. I have this big poofy hair. It's not that poofy right now, but I'm this exotic person in school, like, you know, all the questions that we all get as kids. Were you born in a pyramid? Do you ride a camel? Are you related to King Tut? And like that stuff didn't always bother me. But I know that for other people it can be like offensive. And just facing all these microaggressions, like people would assume what I would be willing to do and wouldn't be willing to do, and the experiences that I had and didn't have at school based on what they thought that they knew about my family background. And like it was really, really tough growing up for a while. Like just I don't I'm not allowed to be Egyptian enough according to many of these people that I'm interacting with at church, mainly like older servants in the church, because I was growing up with a few people who had like gone through the same thing as me, and we're kind of in that middle ground. But like then I go everywhere else in my life and like I don't feel fully American, like which is another interesting thing, how a lot of people defined like being Egyptian versus being American. Being Egyptian is like where a lot of your like values come from. You value family a lot differently and a lot more because of your roots, and you know the customs that you partake in. All of these things build up a majority of who you are, but being American signifies more like a space for you to just like be and just be who you are freely, which I think is the goal for many of our parents and our grandparents when they come from Egypt to begin with. And it's more signifies a place where I can be educated and given opportunities that maybe I wouldn't have if my family didn't come to the States. So as far as like language goes, I found that it wasn't actually always fluency in Arabic, but exposure just to the Arabic language in general that had some sort of correlation with feeling more emotionally attached to Arabic and Egyptian culture, which was very interesting. I was not expecting that at all. And there's, you know, the flip side of my situation. I have friends who came from Egypt when they were very young, had a very thick Egyptian accent, and faced a lot of different just like hardships in school for that, and like people asking them to pronounce certain things in English because it sounded funny, or you know, all these things that many people who come from Egypt face. And so they either like really feed into that and hone in on that, and they further isolate themselves, because maybe they just don't intend to assimilate into American culture at all. But others are like, no, I'm here, I'm rejecting all of that, I don't want to be made fun of anymore. Like it's really exhausting to be caught in that crossfire. It's like you have to pick a side, this feeling that you have to pick a side. And now, you know, a lot of the people that I talked to that were originally fluent in Arabic when they came from Egypt and lost all of it, and now have developed some sort of an American accent when they're speaking Arabic and on the phone with their relatives or at church again. It's they feel like they've lost something because other people are so ready to point it out, anything at all. And like my mom has experience with this too, like her not many people know this, but Arabic was her first language, because her grandmother didn't speak a word of English. And many people wouldn't guess that just because, you know, she is like, she very closely identifies with American culture, and she's, you know, her family, their goal from Egypt, which is not the case for every family, was to assimilate as much as they could and just, you know, make it through. And people comment on her Arabic all the time in church, like, oh, your Arabic is so cute. And it's like, no, that's her first language. Like, people are so ready to assume, and like people, when they hear my dad speak Arabic during like anything in church, it's a whole other like shock factor. They're like, what? Like, I thought he was American, just because, you know, he's a little bit lighter. And like it's really interesting, like, because the Egyptian community, or just being Egyptian itself, has like one of the most diverse, like physical appearance wise, has such a big range of like physical appearances, and like skin tones and like hair colors and hair types and all these things. And I feel like when sometimes, especially when a lot of families have come here, they want to hold on to that. So they want to make sure whoever is allowed to be identified as fully Egyptian, should have some markers or like criteria to do so, which I think creates like a really unhealthy like attitude in a lot of people like myself, who are, you know, identify as bicultural. um yeah, and I think that that can be really helpful. I think that I just became so exhausted with trying to choose that I kind of just had to accept at one point that I was both. And then I learned to really, really love that, because I was exposed to many experiences that a lot of my Egyptian friends weren't, and that a lot of my white friends weren't. And like, I am now like more able and equipped to interact with almost any type of person that I meet, because I have such a diverse palette of experiences under my belt. Um, I am able to communicate with others who are very different from me in a way that my parents really struggle to do, or my American friends really struggle to do. Um, so I also found that um, bicultural and multicultural adolescents are having this almost innate sense to like analyze any given situation,
Mm.
and kind of read people a lot better and interpret what's happening, and communicate better interculturally, um, with almost anyone, which is a gift. And what else? There's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah.
A lot, like, yeah, so we talked about language barriers, intercultural, like, communication, um and there's so much more. One other thing that came up was obviously the difference in belonging to an individualistic culture, like Americans, versus collectivistic culture, very collectivistic cultures such as Egyptians, um, and how Egyptians are collectivistic almost to a fault sometimes, and Americans are definitely individualistic to a fault sometimes. And that is really hard to navigate, especially as a kid.
Can you
Um,
explain that just for people, just so in case somebody's not familiar?
Oh, yes. So individualistic culture being like everything is very based on the individual, and you're more independent from a young age, and priority is placed on self-development, to become like a functioning individual within society, whereas a collectivistic culture places a lot more emphasis on not just family, but communities and groups that you belong to within that cultural group, and that the development and the greater good of the collective or the group is more important than the development of the individual. Um, does that make sense? Is that a good?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of used individual and collective in the definition for,
Sorry, yes, I did do that.
but yeah,
Um, yeah. So I guess a lot of people talked about when they were younger that they almost everyone, I guess the easiest example, they use the play date and the sleepover example, of asking their parents to have a play date or a sleepover, and that being such a foreign concept in Egyptian culture, like having your kid going over to someone else's house just by themselves, because Egyptian gatherings take place again with families, multiple families together. um, and so it was really hard for a lot of us to make friends as easily growing up, um, because and that also, like, it doesn't look good for the parents of our American friends when we keep saying no, and oh, my mom like doesn't want me to. There's like this lack of trust there, which obviously doesn't cross the mind of the Egyptian parent, which is just a really great example of why intercultural communication is so important. Like, if we don't understand how each other's mind operates based on their own experiences and their own upbringing, there's a lot of room for conflict. And
or it does cross their mind, and it's not like, oh, it's misperceived as a lack of trust. No, no, no. There's an actual lack of trust.
yeah, sometimes there is. That's very true. Sometimes there is an actual lack of trust.
Right. Like if you tell your parents, like, well, I wouldn't want them to get the wrong idea that we don't trust them. Like, we don't.
Yeah, it's like we don't care. And again, that attitude of like, it's not really about you or that one person's feelings, it's about our collective safety. I don't want you getting influenced by them in the wrong way, which like seems very harsh, but it is true.
And God forbid you say, don't you think that, it's a little harsh? Harsh? You think your life is harsh? And then you get into like the whole, like, back in
Yep.
Egypt and blah, blah, blah. It's like, you don't know harsh, and like, Mashadif, when like, okay, like, never mind. I won't talk again. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, no, it is definitely a difficult thing to struggle with. And then um even more pain can result from that when we get older, because we come from families and from homes where we are constantly surrounded by family, and people who are caring for us and asking us how we're doing, and we're always asking how they're doing. And American culture just doesn't share that same concern. That's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just different.
Hmm.
um and I think it's really easy for um us as Egyptians to be like, Americans are so consumed with their own problems, and they're so insensitive, and which is true a lot of the times. Like, there were a lot of stories that I had heard of, um you disclosing some very personal information or talking to someone about a very sensitive topic that was important to you, or like, there was a bombing in Egypt this weekend and my family goes to that church, and I'm worried for them, and then that person just changing the conversation, like, oh, like, it's fine, don't worry about it, stay positive, like. And I think that that's an experience that many people, at least around my age, um have encountered. But at the same time, when people want to reject completely their American side, it's like, well, that individualism also breeds many positive things like independence to a certain degree. I mean, you're still living under an Egyptian roof, so you won't have the same independence as many of your friends have, which is something that's frustrating, but something that you just have to get through. Um,
Reality.
yeah. But, having more independence, especially as a woman here, than I would have if I had grown up in Egypt, um, and having the ability of free thought and free speech and um, almost like a creative space to interact with, not just other Americans, but people from a wide variety of backgrounds as well. So there's a lot that of good that can come from that individualistic culture. Um, and I did ask all of the interviewees the question. Well, I asked them two questions. I asked them, one, what do you feel, what cultural group do you feel more tied to, American or Egyptian? And then I also asked them which is most central to your identity, being American, being Egyptian, or being a Coptic Orthodox Christian. And just going on the first one, whether you feel more tied to American or Egyptian, obviously it's going to be so different for everyone because, as I said before, there are so many different factors that go into like your achieved identity as an emerging adult. So like how assimilated your family is, exposure to Arabic, how your family, the vernacular that they used when describing American and Egyptian culture, and how they raised you to view culture in general, and whether they taught you to view being American as a positive thing that you should take part of, or no, this is the place that we're staying so we can be free, but we don't intend to assimilate at all. And we need to keep our roots. And if we don't, then we feel like something's slipping. We're letting go of something. We're letting go of ourselves, which is really understandable, honestly. But again, I think it causes a lot of pain and confusion for the children when parents want to cling so hard to one or the other, either American or Egyptian. And but overall, most people did say that they felt more tied to Egyptian culture because, as I said before, they're more emotionally attached because that's their family. Those are the people that are closest to them in their lives, people that they interact with at church who share their faith with them, and people who view like family the same. And I think ultimately how you view family and your moral values and your ethical values is going to trump how you or supersede how you value maybe like independence or education for many people. Because at the end of the day, relationships are the most important part of you forming your own identity. There's a difference between how you view yourself and how others ascribe or assign a certain identity or label onto you, which is what makes growing up bicultural and multicultural so difficult. Is you have this view of yourself like, I feel very close and tied to Egyptian culture, and I also love and appreciate American culture very much, but then you have people from your family or from other people at church telling you, no, you're not, you don't agree with me on this political view, so you're not Egyptian. You didn't know how to say this in Arabic, so you're not Egyptian. And that that taking that in from the outside and kind of negotiating that tension internally is going to have a big effect on how you ultimately view yourself. Yeah, there's so much. I feel like I'm rambling on.
It's
But
making my life a
you
lot
have
easier.
like what was
Like
that?
there's people like I needed to prompt with questions, and there's people that I needed to like Alex was absolutely infuriating. Like, Alex kept like interviewing me, and I'm like, Alex, like please, like tell us what you think. Like nobody cares what I think. What do you think? Um, so you're making my life really easy because not only are you talking, I don't even need to ask you anything. I'm like, oh yeah, that's interesting. I would have. Oh, yeah. It's like you're asking yourself the follow up questions and then answering them, which for me, I'm like, oh, this is perfect. Like I can just kind of enjoy the conversation that you're having with yourself. This is great.
um,
So one thing that I noticed though is that you tend to say um, that you're both when I think there's a temptation. And I think if I had to guess, I would probably be one of the people that falls into that temptation of if someone asked you, are you Egyptian or American? I would say neither, but I like that you say both, right? And I think that one of the things that is special about how you're approaching this, and I think is interesting, is that it's a little different than how other people have answered this question. Specifically Nadia, like my friend Nadia, who I grew up with, whose parents are Egyptian, and she was born and raised in Plainview, and Plainview is very similar to Jericho, so they're very close to each other, with only I think one intervening town between them in Long Island. And um, I grew up in Jericho. She grew up in Plainview, but I moved there when I was in seventh grade. So I had all this sort of prior, identity formation that makes me confused. Or like, where are you from? Like, I'm not really from anywhere, right? I lived all over. And for her, she was born and raised in Plainview and still confused, right?
right.
And it's this predominantly Jewish town, like predominantly white town. Um, and her parents being Egyptian put her in a position to go to school for college at NYU for 4 years. And then I forget, like, I think it was like 1 or 2, like 2 years, something like that, where I think she was studying or working, like she was like doing something for a couple years, and then went to Kenya. And she's been in Kenya for, 14, 16, like a long time.
Yeah.
So her entire adult life is in Kenya.
Right.
And you ask her, like, something, and she says, as an Egyptian American. I'm like, Egyptian American? Like, what are you talking about? Like, you're barely Egyptian. Like, your parents are Egyptian. You're barely Egyptian. And American, like, you haven't been American for 16 years. Like, you're Kenyan. So are you like Kenyan Egyptian American? Like, you didn't mention Kenyan. Like, you're basically Kenyan at this point.
Right.
And I think like in our conversation and with other people like Mira Riyadh and like other people that this came up, we kind of threw up our hands and said, well, maybe it doesn't matter, right? Maybe, this identity of being Egyptian or being American is not real, right? And I like your perspective a little bit better in that no, like it is real. There is such a thing as being Egyptian. There is such a thing as being American, and I'm going to define it, right? The definition of what it means to be Egyptian is not claimed by this person who properly pronounces tos, and you're like tos, and they're like
exactly what
oh.
like so frustrating about this. It's like when you have people and like some people are very like aggressive about it. It's like they're protective. Like if you can identify yourself as Egyptian, or even others on the other side telling me if you think that you can identify yourself as American, then I don't know what that means for me anymore.
Right.
And it's like, well, your version of American is so much different from your other also white neighbor next door. It's
Right.
so different. And
Right.
it's what I was trying to uncover with this study is that we negotiate the meanings of the words that we use in the language, and we negotiate the meaning of our own culture, because culture, we throw around the word culture all the time. Do we really know what that means? It's not just limited to ethnicity. Culture is just a group of people that share the same behaviors, practices, and like beliefs and customs. So, and sometimes a language, but that doesn't mean that, you know, as that's going to last forever. And I think the overarching like bird's eye view of this study for me was that, well, why is this coming up now? Like what's the big deal? And I think it's just, I think we forget that the world is changing very fast, and that with globalization, you have all of these different groups interacting with each other. You have um, French Algerians living in Turkey, and Armenians living in Greece, and French Lebanese people living in France. And this is not something that's just distinct to America, because we're, we like to call ourselves the melting pot, or whatever. The fact is that culture is, it's no longer restricted to physical borders anymore, just because of the way that we're able to like transport all around the world, and we're interacting with different people. And if one cultural group is interacting with another cultural group, eventually we're going to negotiate a new middle ground, a new culture. And in a lot of studies that I was reading on kids who grew up in 3, 4 different cultures, and they were asked about like, well, do you behave the same in all cultural contexts that you interact with? Because, excuse me, because there's many studies done on something called frame switching, which is basically just the idea that if you are multicultural or bicultural, you operate with multiple like cultural lenses, like my Egyptian schema, my Egyptian lens, and my American schema, my American lens. So what happens when I layer those two? And for a lot of them, they said very subconsciously that they can turn on a dime and just switch in their thinking, in the way that they behave around certain people, in certain topics that they're willing to discuss or not discuss, in the way that they describe themselves. So that's another very interesting thing on language, is in, collectivistic cultures, the language, if you ask an Egyptian person, who are you? They'll say, I'm a mother, I'm a daughter, I'm a wife, I'm a family member, I'm a sister, I'm a Muslim, I'm a Christian. In relation, they're describing themselves in relation to other people as a collectivistic culture. If you ask an American who they are, they're going to say, I am a doctor, I am a philanthropist, I am a motivational speaker. So those vast differences are automatically going to change the way that we think, right? Because our thinking affects our language, and our language affects our thinking. So
Right.
when you have all of those different thoughts and experiences mixing together, there's no way that everyone's going to maintain just like a box, their own box that they can check. I'm Egyptian, I am American. It's not the case anymore. And I found personally from my interviews that people fell kind of into 2 different categories of like achieved identity. What does that look like for you? People either had this sort of blended identity where they took all the cultural influences and experiences that they have, and they just kind of blended it into their own personality and identity and views, which I would say is more of what I am and identify as. And that basically just means that we don't participate in frame switching as much. And that means that I'm going to act the same way in front of my very Egyptian grandfather and father as I am when I'm meeting a new, one of my friend's white American parents. because I'm going to maintain my same belief system. I'm not going to shy away from certain topics. Who I am is who I am, and I'm projecting that to the world, and that affects how I interpret the environment around me. And I say that I'm both because, you know, I think a lot of people, again, harbor a lot of resentment towards when they're younger, towards the fact that they can't fully belong to one cultural group or the other. But what we have to realize is that we have a tremendous gift in that we get to pick and choose, like, what do I agree with from American culture, what aligns with my innermost core values from American culture, and then I can reject what I don't want because I know of other things that I have access to. And what values from Egyptian culture most closely align with my inner core values, and the other things that I don't identify with, you know, that's okay because I have American culture, and the things that I agree with that to fall back on. So again, like I feel like I can communicate with ways and empathize with people in a certain way that my parents can't, and a lot of my other peers can't, but a lot of my other bicultural and multicultural peers can. Um, and so that, I think that's a reason why I'm, you know, most close with people who are also bicultural. And then, you know, people who don't identify with like a blended identity form this kind of coexistive identity where they just kind of have these different cultural lenses, and depending on the cultural context, that's going to bring out one or the other. So when they're with their family, they're automatically, without even thinking, going to avoid certain topics, speak a certain way, like use certain vernacular, whether no matter the language that they're speaking in. They're going to view personal space differently. So they might be more comfortable like being like physical with someone versus like in their Egyptian family versus in American culture where physical space is like a little bit more valued, and that it's weird if you get too close to someone, but that's not something that is a thing in Egyptian culture. I really don't think that many of us growing up realize that we do that. Like I don't think many of us realize, like at church or even not at church, if you're meeting an Egyptian adult for the first time that you don't know, you automatically go shake their hand, hug them, and kiss them on both cheeks without even a thought. But if I'm being introduced to Stacy, my friend's mom, I'm not going to do that. Like that's simply not going to happen. That would be very awkward. And I don't like think about that. I don't like process that before I do it. I just automatically do it. And there's a certain power in that, and I am like, it's for that reason, like I have, you know, a lot of Indian friends and Ethiopian friends and Armenian friends and Russian friends, and I'm just so much like more able to like connect with them quicker, I want to say, than maybe others, because I can kind of sift through the differences and um understand their background and their experiences better because I have so many of my own experiences and things that I've seen and heard and been influenced by. I have all of those things at my disposal to draw back on. Um, yeah, and I think probably the most like uh, beautiful aspect of this study, as I said before, was looking at how being Coptic plays into all this. Like for me, what I was saying earlier, when I can pick and choose what I identify with from American and Egyptian culture, I think the middle ground for that, my moral compass for that, is in my faith, in being a Coptic Orthodox Christian. And every single person that I interviewed, pretty much without hesitation, when I asked them, what is most central to your identity? Not what is your identity, but what's most central. American, Egyptian, or being Coptic, everyone said being Coptic. And I think that has a lot to do with just like a lot of the shared experiences of being Coptic specifically, not just being Egyptian. And also just like the collective trauma that sometimes comes with being Coptic. I heard a lot of people use that phrase, collective trauma. And like just the fact that your families are coming sometimes from a place of persecution, a lot of the time, and sometimes maybe for other reasons like seeking education or whatever it could be. But I found that religion and the role that religion plays in identity is very different in the Eastern cultures than it is in the Western cultures, which was probably the most interesting thing that I found from this study, is that in Eastern cultures, faith and spirituality in general are viewed as your way of life. So that determines every decision that you make throughout your day. And, sometimes other factors like who you marry and where you decide to live in general, and just anything that you're doing or thinking, and what you believe in general. And in Western culture, religion is something that's very much linked to your like activities that you do. So I go to church twice a year, or I go to church every Sunday, or I like participate in this fellowship group. That's what a lot of Americans will say when you ask them to talk about their faith. But when you ask like a Coptic person or a Muslim person or like a Buddhist person or a Hindu person, what does their faith mean to them? Like what is tell me about your religion. They're gonna tell you all, look, it's how I make decisions. It influences what I believe about the world, and it controls, all of my thoughts and my feelings and how I make relationships with others. And so that can also be very, very frustrating to negotiate among, your American friends and your Egyptian friends. Like if I think I told you this before, but like if I go, like if I'm describing what my faith means to me and how it plays a role in my life to one of my American friends, they're gonna like think that that's like kind of weird. Like that's a little bit much. Like, you should kind of like focus on like other things maybe. And there's a lot of like, oh, like you should be more independent, you should be a free thinker, all this, all that, we've all heard it. And yeah, and like to me, I'm like, I don't understand. Like you say that you identify with a certain faith, but like to me that's so weird that all you talk about is just things that you do and people that you see at these events, and like it's very much compartmentalized religion in American culture. And not to say at all that Americans don't take their faith seriously or anything like that. I don't want that to be what I'm saying or the message that I'm sending, because I don't believe that. But there's just such a different priority placed on faith and religion and how it feeds into your identity in general in Eastern and Western cultures. So yeah, there's still so much. I feel like if you ask me specific questions, I can probably give you more specific answers.
I haven't been able to ask you a question yet. So most people I've asked like several questions, one of which was like a highlighted question where I go, I must ask you something. And in your case, every time I lead up to a question, you start answering something related to what I would have asked. So I'm like,
I'm sorry. I should let you talk.
Listen, I think that um, of the two extremes, and you guys are the extremes, like you and Alex are the bookends
Mhm.
for how much talking I've had to do. Um, of the extremes, you're the one I prefer. Um,
Okay.
I mean,
Okay.
I prefer you in general to Alex, but that's true, I think, in more than just talking. Um, so, um, yeah, I again, I didn't get to stash you anything, but I
No.
think, I mean, I don't know. Like, I think all of the questions I would have had, you answered. Um, and I guess the one thing that I maybe if I would stash you something, or I must stash you something. I'm out of practice here now that I'm not doing this every day. Um, you're the third one, by the way, that's in the non-Movember. So I'm
Okay.
now doing this once a week, and you're the third week after Movember,
Okay.
which is pretty cool. I think that it's going to keep going, or it looks like at least. And it's sustainable. Like I feel like I can do this pace, like not every day. But if I must ask you something, um, I think it's interesting that you, you you emphasized how religion is an identity, and emphasized how being Coptic is more important than being Egyptian or American. And I'd like you to connect that back a little bit to this idea that, well, you can't tell me that I am or am not Egyptian. You can't tell me that I am or am not American. Is that true also of being Coptic? Is that also true of our faith?
Hmm.
Is that something we can self define?
I think that that's a really tough question because within every like Coptic community, even around the states, like they're their own niche kind of. There's certain cultural like Coptic cultural norms that arise, within certain areas of the states. So like, but I think overall, our dogma, our values, what we believe is the same. And I don't know. I think, within the context of our faith, I don't think that you can ever tell someone that they're not Coptic because that's not really our place, you know?
I mean, where I'm coming from is that I agree with you, and I think that, there's some basic questions that relate to being, Coptic or being Christian in general. Like, do you believe in God? I mean, not do you doubt the existence of God? I think, there's people that answer that with yes, and then there's people that are fooling you or fooling themselves. So,
Yeah.
yes, like we all doubt, like we all wonder, we all question on some level, but when it comes down to it, like where do I fall on this line of yes or no? I'm gonna go with yes, right? I believe in God, right? I love God, and my experience with God makes it impossible for me to say that if you asked me, like, even on my worst days of my worst doubts, do I have faith? Yes.
Mhm.
um which God do I believe in? The Trinitarian God, where you know uh, there is this narrative of salvation
Mhm.
that is delivered in the person of Jesus Christ, in the incarnation, crucifixion, resurrection. And do you participate in this story in some way? Yes, I participate through the sacrament of confession and the sacrament of communion.
Mhm.
So I think, I mean, to me, like, like if you say I believe in God, that is a Trinitarian God who is worshipped in the liturgy, that I participate in on some what I would define to be a regular basis
Hmm.
of you know, communion, confession, and you know, that's it. Like to me, that's enough. But I think, like you're saying, in different communities, there comes added baggage with that. Like, well, there's also an expectation that you do this. There's also an added expectation that you don't do that. And I
Right.
think there's a lot more don'ts sometimes than do's.
Right.
So is someone else allowed to tell you you don't, and the example that keeps coming up is you don't eat molokhaya, you're not allowed to be Coptic. But I think when we're talking about it less as a Egyptian culture and more as a Coptic spiritual culture, you know,
Yeah.
I do this thing, and one of my guests, and I won't call this person out here, but you know, decided to pull out something he was drinking like while, and I was like, oh my god, what are you doing?
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, like there's nothing against our faith. Like for him to have like one social drink, like you know, all the Catholics do it, all the Eastern Orthodox do it. You know, there's nothing against. I mean, yes, we don't believe in you know drinking heavily or poisoning your liver or making bad decisions because you're drunk. Like nobody's you know advocating for a um, you know extreme alcoholic culture,
Right.
but to have a social drink, there's nothing against our faith. And I was like, oh, astaghfirullah azim. Oh my God, I can't. And I'm like, what are you doing? And then like I'm thinking, I'm like, hey, relax. Like, you know,
Yeah.
if you're doing something wrong, you know, yes, edit or censor or whatever. He's not like, or
He's
maybe not even. Yeah, but I'm like, what's wrong with that?
Yeah,
Uh,
no, I do see what you're saying. Yeah. I think it's a really big problem, people equating Coptic with Egyptian culture, because it's so inaccurate, and it's so, I don't know, like I just, there are a lot of people like that, maybe I'll be, with one of my Coptic friends, and some, I don't know, we'll engage with someone who's not Coptic, and they'll ask like, oh, like Coptic Christian, Coptic Orthodox Christian, like what does that mean? And they'll say, oh, like it just means we're Egyptian. And I'm like, no, like that's not, like it drives me bonkers. Like I understand, like if you're just like if it's a quick conversation, like whatever, just give them it's a straightforward answer. But for people who, in all my relationships at least, like if people are asking about my faith, I take it very seriously to give them something besides, oh, we're Egyptian. Like yes, the word Coptic in front of our faith signifies the language that we pray in and that we praise in. But at the end of the day, it's so much more than being Egyptian. And there's a lot of being Egyptian that has no part of being Coptic, and that we actually disagree with. And there's like a lot of, for especially for Christians living in Egypt, a lot of tension between that identity. Like here I am, I'm part of the 8 or 10% of people in this country that's very hostile to me and my faith. And I identify as a Coptic Orthodox Christian. And I think that there are certain markers that can't be denied that identify if you are or aren't a Coptic Orthodox Christian, like you were saying, like your basic beliefs. And do you participate in liturgy and things like that? But without getting too much into that, um being influenced by the dominant Islamic culture in Egypt, there's a lot that finds its way into Coptic communities, that we don't believe in, which is, I think, something that churches in America are also really, really struggling with. Like, is the men taking communion first? Is that part of being Coptic? Like, no, that's something that developed from very strong Egyptian culture. Um, and I think it only makes it worse when people who are very, very American who attend our church get frustrated with those things, and then people who lean toward being very, very Egyptian are very frustrated that we're frustrated about that. And it just creates this like ticking time bomb about who's going to win. And I think, I see a very positive change happening, though, I have to say, especially in the last few years, of we are really starting to re-examine like what's our faith, push aside American culture, push aside Egyptian culture. Like the only thing that we care about is what is being Coptic. And more importantly, like sometimes let's even forget about Coptic. What is an Orthodox Christian life? What does that look like? Because that's really what's important. And I think, to go back to your question about, can you tell someone whether or not they're Coptic, whether they're Coptic Orthodox Christian? I think, again, faith is such a different concept than ethnicity or nationality, where you can kind of mix and match with nationality. It's really just about how you were raised in the countries that you lived in and the languages that you're exposed to and whatever else, the experiences that you've had. There's a spectrum there. There is like, okay, I identify with these things from this culture and these things from that culture, and I am made into a whole person. But when we're talking about faith, I think it's different. I think you either have to be Coptic Orthodox or you're not Coptic Orthodox. It's not like, oh, I'm a little bit Coptic Orthodox, but I'm also a little bit Hindu or Hindi, excuse me. Like that's not how it works. And I think I've heard a lot of people in school try and say like, oh, I'm half one religion, half another religion. And I think that just goes back to, again, the priority placed on religion and understanding like, what does that actually mean for you? Does that mean the activities that you do, like you go to a Hindu temple sometimes, but you also go to church sometimes? Or does that mean, no, I believe in, one God versus I believe in many gods, right? So I think that that's something that needs to be distinguished, that yes, culture is going to influence faith. Like I'm sure for the Russian Orthodox community, they have some things in Russian culture that are not in line with the Orthodox faith that kind of invade a little bit. We're always going to have that issue, but I think we just need to be really, really cognizant of, the fact that our faith should be, at least from a Coptic perspective, our faith should be the most central thing.
Have you gotten a chance to watch the mustache interviews that I told you about with Yusuf and with Marcos?
No, I did not yet.
So I think that'll be the next step, is to have you watch theirs and have them watch yours, because you guys have different perspectives on culture and how to define culture. And I think the next layer of this is going to be to have people who express to me different opinions and on things that I could see it either way. Like I see it your way and I'm like, that's interesting. And I heard Yusuf and I'm like, that's interesting. And I heard Mark and I'm like, that's interesting. I'm like I don't know, like I don't have the myself, I don't have the experience or the knowledge to be able to disagree with any of you guys. But I'm hoping that you guys, in a healthy way, not like you're wrong, but like in a healthy way, to be able to help each other draw out like sort of the essence of your opinions, by pushing back a little bit, because I think they see our culture more of as a sort of interpersonal culture. And I think you and I see it more as a spiritual culture, right? Like these are our spiritual values and they see them as sort of interpersonal cultural values. And each of them has like a different spin on it. But I think hopefully we'll be able to get them back and get you scheduled with them. And I don't like, I don't know what we're going to do. Like, I'm going to have to start interrupting people because if all three of you, like you're again like the far end
I'm
of the,
sorry. I'm sorry.
I'm gonna be like, all right, settle. Like we're gonna have to do like okay, time out, time out. So I've got a couple people actually, and a couple different groups in mind. And Father Daniel suggested like we need to have some kind of format and some sort of process. So we'll see how that works out. But
Yeah, I think there's just too much to unpack
yeah,
in this topic that like questions and format are very helpful because then
yeah.
we can actually focus it a little bit more. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think we'll figure out how that is going to work. But I'll look forward to having all three of you guys here, and we'll have 4 boxes going. And I'm going to be excited.
I'm
Uh,
also excited.
any final thoughts, young Mina?
No, honestly. I feel like I talked a lot. There's more spinning around in my head, but I think unless you have a direct like, question.
No, I actually like part of me was like, if you ask her if she has any final thoughts, you're going to get another 20 minutes.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I'm like, God, let's see what she does with it.
Yes.
Um,
Can you tell I'm passionate about
yeah,
it?
we love it. And you remember when I asked you for that feedback on the paper, and you wrote me like another paper in response, and I was like, okay, why don't you write something? So yeah, I really enjoyed it, and again, like you answered all of the questions I would have asked. So like
Okay.
it was like you talked a lot, but it was all, there was not tangential. It was all things that I would have asked follow-up questions. So thank you for saving me the trouble, and thank you for not being Alex in so many ways.
I did see that one. I will say I did see that one and I was cracking up. I wasn't surprised though.
Torture. He's torture.
I don't think we give him enough credit though.
Listen, like I do give him credit, and even in the conversation, like it's not like I'm sitting there like giving him the Rafi treatment where like it's just abuse heaped up on abuse. Like no, it's abuse, but with like some appreciation. And I'm like, okay, I think I don't like it. It makes me uncomfortable because he's so different from me.
Mhm.
Um, but I do appreciate, and I'll send him things that I write because I know he's the one that's going to be able to pick out like, no, you're making an assumption here, and that's because you blah 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 blah, and I don't blah 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 blah, and therefore you need to blah 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 blah. I'm like,
Right.
okay, like so if it passes Alex's test, then that's when I know I'm being at least somewhat objective. Um, so yeah, no, lots of credit. I do give him lots of credit, but it's still infuriating. Like he's like he infuriate, and I tell him like a lot of it's me, like it's my own sort of uh insecurities or my own biases, and like he exposes them, and like I'm like, can't you just let me be? But he definitely contributes to my growth, and then I hate that. So yeah, we'll try to figure. I don't know who. The problem is if if I bring Alex back and it's anyone who's remotely interested in having a conversation, it'll be me talking to the other person and Alex sitting
Now
there.
it's sitting there. Yeah.
You know that look like he gets you.
Oh, I do. I do know it. Yeah.
So I'd love to have him back. I just don't know in what context he would actually speak.
I think maybe he'd be a good moderator for me and
But he's not going to interrupt any of you. It's going to be like a 3-hour episode. No, listen, if there were someone else that like we needed to draw out, like throw Alex in there. Alex will, you know, do his magic, and they'll be able to really shine. But again, like in a group dynamic, I don't know. I like maybe put him like maybe if I have two, and then I just need a third because I have OCD and I want the 4 boxes to go. And I'm like, listen, I really just want these 2 people to talk, and like you can be your mute self. Then I'll be just pleasantly surprised that like he'll sit there and actually contribute things, and then I'll just like accept the reality that like what I really wanted was for those 2 people to talk and for him to just be a empty box, which would be fine.
Yeah.
Maybe. I don't know. We'll see. It's a work in progress. But thank you, Anna. Nice and neat as always. Thank you. And I guess we'll see you next time. Say bye or something, anything.
Oh, okay. Bye.